So welcome to session 2. We're going to take a walk through the science and practice of connectivity conservation this afternoon. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that I live and I walk and I work every day on Aboriginal land, and I'm forever grateful for the opportunity. I'd like to particularly pay my respects to Elders past, present and emerging, and to all First Nations people in the room today. My esteemed colleagues and I will take you on a journey today in this afternoon around the science and practice of connectivity conservation, which is one of the key pillars of the Great Eastern Ranges. And to set the scene, I'd like to take a bit of a trip through some landscape to species-specific science and practice that I've been involved with. Next slide, please. In the early 2000s, 2 regional biodiversity management plans were developed within New South Wales and South East Queensland. These were the Border Ranges Rainforest and Northern Rivers Regional Biodiversity Management Plans. Sorry, I've jumped myself. Let me back up a bit. By definition, conservation science is the study of the physical, natural world through observation, experiment and application. It's based on and drawn from the knowledge of First Nations peoples, landowners, people who live and work in nature, as well as the applied sciences of survey techniques and technologies. It is the practice of connectivity conservation is fundamentally the bringing together of community and science in order to sustain, protect and improve the health and resilience of people and country. Next slide, please. Right, now we're together. In the early 2000s, there were 2 regional biodiversity plans I was involved with, were developed, New South Wales, South East Queensland, Border Ranges and Northern Rivers Regional Biodiversity Management Plans. These were innovative plans at the time, and they were really strongly built on community and stakeholder participation. They were strategic landscape planning documents that relied on the best available science at the time, and they were tiered planning approaches to holistic management of landscapes, regions down to ecosystems, and at the bottom, threatened species specific actions. They considered within the human and environmental constraints what the best conservation priorities and repair priorities might be for a landscape, and how they might be put together for maximum benefit. And in some ways, somewhat similar to some of the stuff that was being done in New Zealand in a similar period of time. Underpinning these plans was biodiversity modelling that was developed by Dr. Simon Ferrier and his team, and you'll be hearing from Simon later in this session. And that modelling was highly innovative and pivotal to the developing of the plans at the time. Next slide, thanks. So out of these processes, we established the need for regional partnerships of multi-tenured, multi-agency, community, government working together to try and implement these large-scale strategic planning documents. And as part of that, we established the Border Ranges Alliance and the Jalagir Biodiversity Alliances, and we also established the Northern Rivers Fire and Biodiversity Consortium, all of which were regional partnerships. For the Border Ranges Alliance, it focuses on connectivity conservation in rainforest and associated vegetation in the northeast of New South Wales, South East Queensland, and it uses the planning framework of the plan to identify habitat and connectivity conservation priorities, and then seeks to obtain funding from various sources to support community in on-ground restoration and protection. Next slide, thanks. Similarly, the Jalagir Biodiversity Alliance sits around the Coffs Harbour, Bellingen region of the mid-north coast of New South Wales, and we have a number of Jalagir representatives here at the conference today. This is a voluntary partnership of over 20 key natural resource management partners who deliver regional connectivity conservation programs within the region, and just a couple of the programs are highlighted on the screen. Next slide, thanks. So within these sort of frameworks and big picture conservation approaches, where do conservation detection dogs sit in all of that? So jumping from the broad scale holistic to the very site specific and focused work, basically connectivity science and practice requires knowledge and it requires data for decision making. Human-based surveys typically rely on the use of our hearing and our vision to collect data and collect knowledge. What dogs offer us is that they see the world through their noses. So they provide us with a third landscape that we can learn about and collect data on. And they see the world through olfaction. We use this olfactory landscape knowledge to contribute to conservation programs through research, baseline data collection, monitoring and management. And over the next few slides, I'd like to just run through some of the examples where the canines that I work with are contributing to connectivity conservation programs along the GER. Next slide, thanks. Stay with that one. Great, thank you. So one of the programs we work with is two antechinus species. They're carnivorous marsupials. They're both endangered, they're cryptic, they're small, they live in very restricted distributions in high altitude forest. They're between 20 and 100 grams in size, and they have a unique biology where the males die after breeding in their first year and the females only live for 2 years. So they're here and then they're gone tomorrow. Both of these species are subject to a range of threats, including increased drought and fire intensity through climate change impacts. They're also predated on by feral cats, and occasionally, in some instances, they get trampled habitat through feral herbivores. The National Environmental Science Program has these both listed within the top 20 Australian mammals and birds at risk of extinction. Next slide, thanks. And if you could play the video. Thank you. So this is a 5-year multi-partner program that's been led by Dr. Andrew Baker from the Queensland University of Technology. It's been a big partnership program with the University of Queensland, federal, New South Wales and state environmental agencies, as well as Aboriginal landholders and World Wildlife Fund. And in the broadest sense, this program has been trying to map and model species distribution, habitats, threats of these two individual species to inform their conservation management going forward. And currently there's a PhD student who's toiling away writing all of this up, and hopefully the research will be out next year. Next slide, thanks. So historically these two species have been surveyed by live capture trapping, so using Elliott traps, but they're hard to trap. There are not many of them, they're quite low numbers, and they're often competing with more common mammals that fill up the space, and there's no room in the traps for them to hop into. So in 2017 there was an honours student who took on a project to look at the feasibility of using scent detection dogs for Antechinus arctos, one of the two species. We had 2 sites that we worked in, and in the Border Ranges National Park, which was one of them, they had historical evidence of Antechinus arctos being present, but they hadn't been able to get confirmation within 30 years despite intensive trapping efforts. So we trained up some detection dogs and we ran them across the site and looked at all the historical sites, and the dogs indicated at 2 of those sites. And we put traps onto the indication points at both of those sites, and these are the 2 sites on the slide here. On the first site at Bar Mountain, we got confirmation of their presence within 24 hours. On the second site, it took 18 months for them to get a camera record of the indications, and we've been getting them in those locations ever since. Next slide, thanks. And play the video if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. One of the other sites is in Springbrook National Park, where there was one site where they had not been able to capture any individuals since 2015. In 2020, as part of a routine survey, we went through and the detection dog indicated at 5 locations across the site. And this was despite extensive Elliott trapping of the site. They placed cameras at the indication points of the dogs, and they confirmed within days that there was more than one individual present and utilising the habitat. So the National Environment Science Program funded some of the contributed funding to this project, and in a report that's available online, they concluded in 2021 that the detection dogs were an effective method of surveying cryptic small mammals, and that the dogs were faster, less resource intensive, and much more likely to detect these species at low densities. Sorry, I didn't put on my timer. And I don't have the key, pass key. Sorry, I'll be quick. So South, I need someone to supervise me. So anyway, in Southeast Australia, koala populations are severely impacted by the 2019-20 fires, following a significant drought. And there were, this has been something we've all been very aware of. Over 5 million hectares of land in the northeast New South Wales was impacted by the fires. There was a significant component of this within the GER. Gary's got my back, it's all good. So the New South Wales Department of Planning and Environment sought to assess the impact of koala populations within National Park Estate in the northeast, and they designed the largest systematic survey that's ever been undertaken of koalas in northeast New South Wales, and this was done in 2020. There were 3 dog teams involved, and with canines for one of those 3. And between us, we surveyed 441 sites across 24 reserves. Next slide, thanks. And play the video, please. So this is Max indicating on a koala scat, and he's making noise like he really does. So one of the sites that we worked on was Iluka Nature Reserve, where the population was thought to be in extremely low numbers in the whole Iluka region. In fact, probably not viable population anymore. This population was also impacted by the fires. But fortunately, about 10 years prior, the Iluka Land Care Group had gone in and done a lot of work in the nature reserve, and they'd planted out forest red gum community back into that reserve. That video was within that reserve, and we found high levels of activity in the reserve, and we also found high levels of activity in other refugia areas within the population's distribution. And as a result of those surveys, the Iluka koala population was actually found to be much more viable than they had previously thought, despite the impact of the fires. Next slide, thanks. So the report, which is available online, pulled together a whole lot of data out of all of these reserves, and it's providing a critical baseline to build future recovery and management for koalas in the National Park Estate. And the report concluded that despite a significant loss of koalas, which was really tragic, they had managed to persist in refugia in some of the low fire severity areas in all of the reserves. But they did warn that any post-fire recovery was going to be highly dependent on reduced fire frequency and intensity in the future. That's a big challenge. Next slide, thanks. So from a regional perspective, we've also been working within the Border Ranges Alliance area, looking within the footprint of the Rapville fire, which was a part of that fire that burnt through under very extreme fire weather conditions. And we've been working with private landholders to find where koalas survived or re-established post-fire to help with restoration, priority setting and conservation works in the footprint. Next slide, thanks. So to date in this project, we've worked on 12 properties. 11 of those 12 had koala activity on them. Some of the sites we surveyed in 2020, which was not long after the fires, had pre-fire charcoal scats showing evidence of them being on the site before the fires. But fortunately, at least on some of them, we found multiple age scats post-fire, so indicating there was some ability of koalas to utilise those habitats post-fire. One of the examples was around the Busby's Flat area where a female and her joey had been sighted immediately after the fire front had gone through, and people were really concerned about what happened to them. We went in and surveyed in May that year, and fortunately found a very high level of activity from both the female and her joey within her habitat, and that's the sort of diagram on the far right of the screen there. So they had managed to re-establish and do okay post the fire. Most of the 2022 surveys that we've been doing have been focusing predominantly on the unburnt sections of properties that are adjacent to the burn footprint, and again looking longer term to habitat connectivity and on-ground restoration programs on those lands. Next slide, thanks. Similarly within the, next slide, thanks. Similarly, within the Jollagee Biodiversity Alliance, we've been working with the North Coast Local Land Services mapping koala activity on properties that have engaged with the koala habitat management land management agreements. We're providing baseline data on where koalas are actively utilising their properties for interest for the landholders, and they're all really excited and engaged in that. And it's also providing monitoring that goes hand in hand with the on-ground works that are being undertaken on those properties. And to date, 11 of the 12 properties, again, it seems to be a lucky number, have been good levels of koala activity mapped, including in rainforest. Next slide, thanks. At a local council scale, we've been working with the Coffs Harbour City Council, mapping koala activity in peri-urban and urban areas of southern Coffs Harbour. These have been surveys looking for detailed activity mapping of the use of the reserves and also collecting fresh scats for genetics analysis. We found with our surveys that the koalas were utilising most, but not all, of the reserves in the urban area. And out of those, but they were using most of them, and they were also moving around between the reserves. So we surveyed 23 sites across 4 corridor linkages. A total of 231 locations were recorded. And then we sent the genetics material away to the detection dog for conservation crew at the University of the Sunshine Coast, thanks to Roman and her team. And they helped us identify 23 individuals through genetics, and there were 12 male and 11 female. And of those, 12 of the koalas were found to be chlamydia-free. And despite it being a small sample size, and very cognisant of that, there were some positive trends, I guess, for an urban koala population. So the genetic diversity compared favourably with other documented populations. The degree of inbreeding was lower than might be expected and lower than the compared populations. And it really highlighted for us the importance of these urban landscapes, urban reserves, and the linkages between those urban reserves, private land and the adjacent national park in terms of providing habitat and sustaining genetic health for an urban koala population. Next slide, thanks. We've also been working with the Coffs Harbour and District Local Aboriginal Land Council. Oh, sorry, next slide. Thank you. Looking to assist them with their cultural burning practices on their lands. So they've been burning koala habitat and other habitats on their properties, and we've been doing the pre and post cultural burn surveys to monitor the koala populations and the impact of those fires. The detection dog teams have been welcomed to country using appropriate protocols, and we've been accompanied by the Durundawaja Rangers during the surveys. We've been detecting koala activity in the habitats both pre and post all of the burns over the last 2 years, and all of this work is going together as an integrated program of habitat improvement for koala and other species on their lands. Okay. Next slide, thanks. We've also been working in the regional riverine connectivity space in the New England tablelands of New South Wales. We've been working with an endemic short-necked freshwater turtle called the Bell's turtle. This turtle is endemic to 3 major river catchments, which are the Buddha Rivers, Guida and Namoy catchments. And these turtles don't start breeding until they're at least 18 years old. And they only leave the water to lay eggs in their nests adjacent to the water. The problem for these particular species is that there's virtually no recruitment into the system. Over 95% of the nests are being predated by foxes every season. So the detection dogs are brought in to help locate nests for protection. Next slide, thanks. So the dogs wear a GPS collar, which allows you to track where they're moving. In the top left-hand corner, you can see the search effort along a watercourse and where the nests were located and recorded. And we've been collecting this data over a 5-year period. And during that time, what we've realised is that there are preferred nesting beaches that these females are constantly using season after season. We initially started out by putting cage traps over every individual nest that we found. And in the last couple of years, we've moved to actually whole nesting beaches with fox exclusion fencing and doing that before the nesting season actually starts. And the chart on the left-hand side, you can see, just shows some promising increase in the successful hatching of nesting and juvenile turtles as a result of this input of the program. Next slide, thanks. So really, we just have the privilege of working with so many regional partnerships, doing this sort of work, and with really passionate and committed people and dogs. And we couldn't do that work without them and without the support of Habitat and access to habitat and the specialist knowledges of others, which bring it all together and actually make it all really feasible to do. So thank you all. Cheers.